All right, a little bit about muscle tissue, and we'll start with smooth muscle. Remember, smooth muscle is not under voluntary control, so we consider it to be involuntary. We can't think about it and contract the muscle. And we'll find smooth muscle all throughout the body in the walls of hollow internal organs. So when we think about the blood vessels or the uterus or the digestive system, stomach, intestines, urinary bladder, all of those, in order for them to contract or blood vessels to constrict or the urinary bladder to squeeze urine out, smooth muscle is going to be involved in that process. All right, if we look at the cells down here, the cells have this, I'm going to move this up a little bit. Cells have this spindle shape to them. All right, to me it looks like Werther's candies. And unlike skeletal muscle, which we'll talk about in a couple slides, the actin and the myosin is arranged in crisscross patterns so throughout the cell, and when they will squeeze like kind of like wringing out a mop. And that process is shown right here. All right, and when they are stimulated to contract, notice that instead of an axon terminating on the muscle like you see with skeletal muscle, you see an axon with multiple synaptic points, which will release neurotransmitters and cause individual cells to contract. And also remember that smooth muscle being involuntary, it is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And depending on which smooth muscles you're talking about, it could be either sympathetic, parasympathetic, or both. Cardiac muscle is the next type of muscle tissue that is also under involuntary control, which means, again, you can't just think about it and the heart will contract. It happens automatically, so that suggests that it is also under the control of the autonomic nervous system. But once we get to the cardiac chapter, we'll find out that cardiac muscle cells can contract on their own as well. The only place we'll find cardiac muscle tissue is in the heart, obviously. That's why it's called cardiac muscle. And there is only one nucleus per cell, as with smooth muscle. So these are individual cells we're talking about. And you notice the cells are also highly branched. And they are striated just like skeletal muscles, which means you have the actin myosin filaments overlapping each other in sarcomeres, but they also have between them these intercalated discs, and in these intercalated discs we have several types of junctional proteins, but the important ones for contraction are these gap junctions. And what happens is when the cardiac muscle is stimulated to contract, the wave of depolarization spreads to all cardiac muscle cells through these gap junctions, which allow the ions, the calcium ions, to pour through so all cells communicate with each other and contract as a single unit. And finally, the muscle that you are probably most familiar with is skeletal muscle, called skeletal muscle because you'll find it attached to the skeleton. And it's involved in the movement of bones. Skeletal muscle is under voluntary control, which means you can think about it and the muscle will move. Each muscle cell has many nuclei because sometime during embryonic development, the individual muscle cells fuse together to form really long muscle cells, which we term muscle fibers. And because of the actin-myosin structure of sarcomeres, we have these striations, these alternating dark and light patterns. Within the muscle fibers themselves, which is why we call it striated muscle. And again, just like smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, they contract in response to nerve signals. So all this slide is telling you to refer to section 5.8, 5.9, and 5.10 in your bare bones workbook, which talks about how muscles are named, how they're referred to in terms of origin, insertion, action, and innervation, and what kinds of things they're attached to. So skeletal muscle is not simply muscle. There are many different types of tissues inside of the muscle, obviously the most abundant being the actual skeletal muscle itself. But you'll also find nervous tissue in there because in order for the muscle to contract, you have to have stimulation by a nerve. You'll also find blood and blood vessels in there because they have to have a nutrient supply and a way to remove waste from the muscles. Connective tissues, dense connective tissue, fascia, which helps hold muscles in place and provides a smooth surface for muscles to slide across one another, as well as tendons, which are extensions of that fascia that actually weave themselves into the periosteum of the bone to which they attach so that they can pull on the bone and move it without having to worry about the muscle coming loose from the bone. Muscles can also be connected to other muscles through sheets of connective tissue called aponeuroses. And typically where you'll find aponeuroses is in the head between your epicranial muscles and the forehead and in the occipital bone. And in the abdominal region, you'll find aponeuroses of the external obliques. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the abdominal region. All right, so individual skeletal muscles are very highly organized. Typically, they will have an outer surrounding fascia that covers them. And then as part of that fascia and just underneath it, we have an external covering bounding all fascicles of muscle together called the epimysium. Between each fascicle here, where you'll see blood vessels and nerves going through the muscle, you'll find the perimysium. And then within a fascicle, between muscle fibers, you will find the endomysium, a connective tissue that separates individual muscle fibers. All right, to extend that concept a little further, each individual fascicle here, which you see protruding out from here, notice the nerve and the blood vessels that would be part of the perimysium. Each fascicle is subdivided further into individual muscle fibers. And these muscle fibers are what contain the contractile units of the muscle, which are termed myofibrils. And notice that the myofibrils are made up of individual sarcomeres here, and remember, a sarcomere is the individual contractile unit of a muscle that contains both myosin and actin that slide across one another to make the muscle shorter in the process of contraction. All right, so from highest order of magnitude to lowest, you have the whole muscle, which would be this, individual fascicles, which would be each one of these, or this thing right here, individual muscle fibers, which would be each one of these within a fascicle, each one of these myofibrils right here, which contain both thick and thin filaments, which you'll find within the sarcomeres themselves. Okay, and this is just another way of looking at that same level of organization from the previous slide.